Well, welcome once again to FBC Pastors Talk, where pastors of this local church sit down and talk through various topics together. I'm Pastor Jared Weimer, and joined once again by Pastor Mike Brown as we continue to talk about things related to the book of Acts, as we've been preaching through that right now on Sunday mornings. So, Mike, today we talk about communism in the early church. So, yeah, now I admit that's quite a provocative title. And I also admit that, yes, I did do that a little bit for clickbait to see if we can get some folks to tune in and see what that's all about. Yeah. We will ultimately talk about that. We will address that. I think that it is kind of an offshoot of the passage we're going to talk about today, which I want to start with that, Mike. Let's first just talk about one of the passages that you got to work through. I think it was... by the time folks listen to this, it was 3 weeks ago, this past Sunday, that you worked through the end of Acts chapter 2. It was right after Peter's Pentecost sermon, right after we saw 3,000 souls were saved and they were baptized. Just an exciting time. I mean, the church literally got started at that moment. And I just want to read that passage. I know it's been several weeks for folks, so I'm going to read that and then let you talk about that for a few minutes. So in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, Luke records, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul. And many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." Now, Mike, I think it's true that we would say that every week, every passage has been exciting. The book of Acts has been just a joy to preach through. But I think this particular passage, you could say, Mike, you were especially excited to get into and to preach on. So just talk about that. What about this passage were you drawn to really get into?
So the title of the series, if I recall, was the continuing ministry of Jesus, right? Is that correct? So the continuing ministry of Jesus, and this is if you want to say, where the story turns, if you want to say, and here it is, the hub of the continuing ministry of Jesus, that he has now indwelt the church to then continue the work of what he did.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that in and of itself, it's kind of like it brings us into the story, right? Yeah. It brought them into the story. It brings us in the story. And then you have this hub of how the Lord is going to continue to work and grow his church for his glory. It's the church. And so it's the church in its very essence, and it's the pureness of the church, and it's the church together, and it hasn't changed in many ways. Now, this was a unique time, and I think we'll talk about that in a second, where it was clearly unique. But at the same time, the main principles that you just read haven't changed, right?
Yeah. Oh, no.
And so you have teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. And so the thing there's a couple things exciting. One, you have all these different backgrounds. You have different families, different nations, different age groups. They came to Jerusalem. Pentecost happened. They're saved. And now they all come together as one. I mean, that in and of itself is amazing.
Yeah.
We have this, even right now you have the Olympics going on, right? And so you have all these nations and tongues and tribes coming together. But they're coming together, obviously, for sport.
Yeah.
And really to say who's the best, which they're not coming together for this. They're coming together because of something supernatural that happened.
Yeah. And I think we forget the diversity we think, these are all Jews in the sense that they were believers in Judaism, but they weren't all Jews. They were from all over. And you forget that.
Yeah. And so they're saved, and then what happens? Well, they start meeting together, and they're in these homes. They don't even know these people pre-Pentecost, a lot of them, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you see the absolute necessity of dependence on the Lord, but then interdependence on one another. And obviously, as we go through, and I think we just saw that, or we'll see that soon over the next couple of weeks, of just these immediate oppositions that are going to take place, and how important it is that they have not only dependence on the Lord, but interdependence on one another. And so, again, that's just for our church and our time. I think that's exciting because we have to continue to stick to the main, what is the main, those four principles, if you want to say, that is the church. And then we need each other just as much as they did.
Yeah, amen.
And so, I think those were the kind of the main things that excited me most about that. I mean, it's just talking about our family.
Yeah.
I use that term a lot from the pulpit. Like, this is our family. It's because we believe that. Like, this is our family.
Yeah.
Those are some of the things that just excite me.
And I like how I remember back when we were talking through this, you said the turning point, or this is kind of where things get going. And I think the reason is because this is where we can jump in and really relate to this. And, not that we can't follow Peter's example in doing what he does with boldness, but yet we know the miracles are not permanent and the tongues are not permanent. And we kind of look at these one-time transitions, but this is this is where we can really see ourselves in this story, so to speak, and then emulate.
Well, I mean, this is really most of the Christian life, right?
Sure.
I mean,
right.
Especially for us. I mean, we're not going to do what happened to John and Peter. Like, we're not going to stand before the Supreme Court of the land and have to respond. We're going to do this. We're going to break bread together. We're going to be together. We're going to pray together. And really, I mean, when you look at those who are engaged in the life of the church, this is a big, huge part of their life.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we do.
And to your point, they needed to. Yeah. I think the need was so much more felt because, they if they didn't do this, how would they eat? How would they survive? How would they? And I think, that is one of the downsides of the church in America is we can feel a bit self-sufficient and feel like we can get by without these things when really we cannot. Mm. And I think in your message, you did a good job of addressing that and talking and challenging our church that this is what we need to be about, but yet also being thankful for our church because in many ways, I think despite the American mindset of independence and so forth, by God's grace, our folks live this out to a great degree.
Oh, absolutely.
That brings us to kind of our hook, so to speak, which is the communism piece. I think I recall, Mike, on Friday or Saturday or Thursday, maybe that week leading up, you called me, and we'll do that at times. We'll pick each other's brains about the passage, what we're seeing, and certain applications. And I remember you called me. You're like, Jared, you said all these commentators are bringing up communism in this passage. So talk about that, Mike. What you found and why you think that was coming up, and we'll talk a minute about communism. So what did you find?
I'm not a history buff. I know you are much more so of that bent, and you just kind of come from that background with your family and stuff like that. But it jumped off the page to me time and again that every single one of these guys brought up the idea of communism, and they were. I felt the fight against it. Like there was a tension in each of the commentaries. And so then we talked through that, and obviously I think that phrase had all things in common. You see the language in the text, which, people jump at that, and then they obviously make a case for this communal living, and that they try and make this case that no one had anything that no one else had. It's kind of like it's all now together, it's all one, no matter what. But you have to consider, I think whenever anyone writes or preaches or teaches, you have to consider the time they live in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're actually going through Calvin's Institutes, even a small group of us right now, is just a side study. And a lot of that stuff makes more sense when you understand what is happening in the time that they're writing that. And so I had to consider those things, and you brought those to my attention that, we have the Cold War, from the 50s to the 80s. That was still taking place, and so these guys are writing these commentaries in light of that.
Yeah.
And so that helped me even just to think through that. So then I had to consider, is this important now to bring out to people?
Yes. That's a call you had to make. Am I going to go after that like the commentaries did, and really then shoot down why communism is not a biblical form of living? And
and so I wrestled with that, and obviously you're going to speak to a little bit of this, of maybe some trends or things that are going on right now, but I chose to not go after it at that point, but I think it's important to be clear on it at the same time.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's what this format is for us then to tackle some of these sidebar things not just reinforce some of the key things, but get into some things that we didn't want to, or didn't have time to, or thought it wasn't best in the messages. But we want to talk about it now because I think you can see in our culture, even though the Cold War is over, that epic conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States is over, but yet we do see this Marxism, which is the root of communism, coming back. It's resurfacing. We see it in different places where we are, in essence, being told that if anyone has something that someone else does not have, that inherently is an injustice. Because what Marxism is that it is a materialistic worldview. There is no spiritual. There is no God. There's no afterlife. And so we define everything by materialism. And so if crime is defined based on everything material, so someone having something that someone else does not have, then that is the great sin against humanity, or that's when injustice. It's not moral. It's not against, there's no God that we're talking about. So we see those things. They're creeping in. We won't talk about the particular ways that they've been creeping in, but I think we do got to think about that because, again, it sounds sometimes spiritual to say that, okay, it's Christians just kind of need to throw everything into one pot, and that's the way we are to live in all places at all times. There's even some conservative wings of the Christianity that would say that, hey, we got to just live that way, or that it's inherently wrong to have any material possessions that are excess, or that we don't have like a specific use for. And I think, again, we got to think biblically. Number one, personal property is an okay thing. I think we go back even to the Old Testament and how God in his providence gave certain people things that others did not have. You had disparity in material possessions, and God said, thou shalt not steal, and so you can't have this command to not steal if you and I, Mike, if someone else has something we do not have, we have to look at that as theirs, that they own that. So personal ownership is a biblical concept from the standpoint of us looking at someone else's things, that God sovereignly has dispensed that to them by his grace, and we are to just allow for that. However, though, the flip side to that is biblically, and I think that's where you do see Acts 2 living coming in, is that from me looking at my own things, I realize that I am not the ultimate owner, that God is. Amen. God has given me these things. He's giving me them. He's given them to me to enjoy. 1 Timothy 6, Paul says that God has richly provided us things to enjoy. That's okay. Amen. But then the posture of that person's heart, though, is to always be generous and ready to share. And that's a key word there, be ready to share. It doesn't say automatically just share because there's no reason. I think, again, going back to your passage, Mike, in Acts 2, and in Acts 4, there's this idea of it was the need that was driving the sharing. And then each person came to the consideration on their own that, you know what, this ultimately isn't mine. I'm not going to see this as my own. Ultimately, I'm going to be open-fisted with the things God has given me. So we don't see like a forced communal living like in Marxism or communism where the state seizes it and says it's wrong for you to have anything that someone else doesn't have. But what we see is God working in hearts when there's a need. And so it's both sides of the coin. We got to balance that.
Amen. You see this right away. I think you already brought this up. You did bring this up, that it was as any had need. Mm-hmm. You see that in Acts 2.
Yeah.
And so we have to consider, okay, so first of all, what's going on? So all these people come in, they come to Jerusalem, then yes, they're saved, Pentecost happens, and then they're living with various people in that area, right? So they're living from house to house, and there's people living in their homes that previously were not living in their homes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's unique in and of itself, first of all. So there were clearly immediate needs that were taking place for housing, for food, for all those things. Some of these people were saved out of their family. Some, their family members weren't saved. And so really a unique time. I was considering too, though, you don't see anywhere in this text, the state had nothing to do with any of this.
The state had nothing to do.
Yes, correct. The state, there was no government mandate, or the government was not coming in and saying, okay, now, by the way, you got to then redistribute all this wealth that you have.
And not even a church doing that. We don't see the apostles ordering that.
Correct. Yeah. So they were totally absent. This situation was completely absent from the government. And so for anyone to run after this text and say, oh, this is a kind of a proof text for communism, to me in many ways is silly.
Yeah.
With that said, obviously there's a supernatural generosity.
Amen.
That as Christians, our lives are walking around with open hands all the time, or they should be.
Right.
Are they? No. Should they be? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yes, we should be living outwardly and obviously upwardly. Well, why? Because the one who gave us everything, we now look to that and say we need to be giving also.
Yeah.
And so for sure there's a challenge there amongst, and so we got to be careful with that, because I think there can be want to push back so hard because of the communistic or the Marxist, those type of things that clearly are recycle themselves. And but we have to be careful with that, because we have to be open-handed Christians.
Yes. Yeah. We don't want to come off as being like, hey, this is my stuff. Don't tell me what to do with my stuff. Well, no, the Bible tells you what to do with your stuff.
Correct.
What's the heart? What is our heart to be towards our stuff, and how are we to use it? It's God has given it to me, but as you pointed out, God has given it to me. So if He's given it to me, He's the ultimate owner, and that's Well,
and the key there in 1 Timothy that you read was ready.
Yeah.
And that is a challenge to me. It's a challenge to you. It's a challenge to our church. Like, are we ready to share?
In the posture, in the starting blocks, Amen. So to speak. Yeah.
And so, it is a challenge. So, I think we need to talk about this communistic piece, but the challenge is, are we ready?
Yep.
Because there's people in real need in our own church, right? And by the way, I think praise the Lord, our church is so kind and things that we don't even see, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we are blessed. And again, I think this exciting / scary part of all this, Mike, is again, we know where things are. It seems we know where things are heading in our culture and being anti-Christian, and we see glimpses of this here and there where people have need. But I guess I'm excited that as we hear this and as our people see this, that if we get to the place the early church was, where we literally have to depend on one another, it really will actually be an exciting time that we'll see God work, because we know God's going to provide for our needs. He promises that. But in our Western society, we've been so used to doing that independently from one another, and who knows, we may have I see an opportunity to provide for the needs of one another. And as you pointed out this past Sunday, let's have it be for the right reasons, for the gospel's sake, not because we're lazy, not because we are losing our jobs for being obnoxious or other things, but for the gospel. And if that's the case, the Lord will provide, and He'll use us. And it's really kind of it's a cool thing to see. So
I was just considering, you want to talk about a light when a church is living in such a way,
right?
That they're just taking care of one another, again, not demanded giving or forced giving, but they're just living in such a way that's supernatural, and just the community has to see.
That's how your passage ended in verse 47. They were praising God after day by day, receiving their food with glad and generous hearts. There's that generosity, that's so key. Praising God and having favor with all people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So the result was a lot were added to the church. But even for those who were not necessarily added, there was a looking at that and saying, you know what, that's otherworldly. That there, at least it was cause for pause, and to look at the church and say, well, that's just not normal.
Absolutely.
And so we just, it's amazing to see the God at work. And I'm just again so excited to know that no matter where things are heading in our culture, that we're going through this book at this time to just be a shot in the arm for us and a reminder. So, well, we hope that kind of satisfied that itch, that we delivered on that. Again, we're thankful for these opportunities. I know last time we talking about the signs and wonders of the apostles. Last time we said we get into that. We diverted for this episode to talk about this. So next time, Lord willing, join us, and we'll get into the signs and wonders of the apostles. and how do miracles and those things fit into redemptive history. But till next time, you can find more episodes of these pastors' talks at our two websites at sermonaudio.com/Faith Bible Church or youtube.com/Faith Bible Church.